Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Anonymous Hedgehog podcast. My name is Maya.
And my name is Rich.
And we'll be your hosts. And today we are going to be discussing all different types of trends. So one of the biggest trends that I fondly remember, and I think you mentioned this when we were talking, was in elementary school, silly bands was a huge trend. I remember there was a point where everyone had silly bands and we were collecting them on our hands, and we collected the different shapes, different colors of the bands. And then it got so bad that people were trading silly bands during class, and the teachers had to ban it off our campus. I don't know if that happened to you, but
Yeah,
it got
it did,
so
yeah.
bad that silly bands were just outlawed in elementary school for and it was
And it
really
wasn't just
crazy.
for one elementary school. It was a nationwide
Yeah.
thing. Most elementary schools were facing this influx of silly bands within their classrooms. And it's so strange considering that the actual product was just a rubber band that has a specific shape to it. And kids got so obsessed with it.
I know, I think I bought mine at the dollar store, and
Yeah.
I begged my mom to buy it, and she was like, "Why do you want this crap?" And I was like,
Yeah.
"It's elevates your social status. I need to have these silly bands." And I held on to them so preciously, and I would trade them. I was like, "Oh, if mine is super cool, then you get to trade 3 of yours for one of mine." And it was super this obsessive cult.
Yeah. Wait, I remember distinctly the whole. In fact, I don't even remember the actual silly bands I had, but what I do remember is the social aspect of it. Because
Yeah.
I think that's what actually gave me that adrenaline rush of look, I'm trading silly bands. There's this whole black market of silly bands. It's it gives you a rush every time you get a new one from someone. And it's just that aspect of I have something and you have the same thing, and we're all part of this greater collection of silly band users that makes us belong to a group.
Yeah, I feel this trend wasn't this trend happens among kids, but it doesn't matter the product. I remember I used to do this with Post-its too. I remember at one point at my elementary school, at least, these colored Post-its were super popular, and
Yeah.
then we would just trade stacks of Post-its. And then I remember at one point those ninja stars are super popular, those ninja stars. And then there's one that you could I don't know how to you collapse the ninja stars and then you expand it.
Oh, I know what you're
Yeah,
talking about.
yeah. People who grew up in the era know exactly what I'm saying.
Yeah.
But I remember we used to do a lot of these trade and kind of barter systems just as kids. No matter what the product was.
Food, Lunchables.
Yeah, we would just
yeah.
trade. Yeah, you would trade Lunchables for other different types of food, and even as kids, we would have kind of a sense of an economy without actually having any money or without actually knowing what businesses and buying things actually meant. But
Yeah.
we had a kind of innate sense of I trade this for this, and it's
Yeah.
the value of certain things.
Yeah, that's so funny that you mentioned that we had an economy as
Yeah.
kids. Because that's so true. It was a completely separate economy, and it was all barter system because no one had money. So everyone was trading things. But what's funny is that as kids, obviously our sense of what is valuable was skewed. I remember back when I was in elementary school, a girl threw a gold coin down the sewer in order to catch a leprechaun. Something like that happened.
Oh my god. Okay.
And I mean, to all of us, we all told her, do it, it's worth it because we'll find the leprechaun. If we don't find the leprechaun, whatever, it's just a coin. It doesn't mean anything. But looking back at that now, that was how can you throw a gold coin down the sewer? And so we definitely had skewed systems of what actually is of value. But it's interesting because all of our skewed systems somehow ended up aligning to the point where it created a whole mini economy.
Yeah, that's so true. I don't really understand how when I thought silly bands are cool, but I guess everyone else thought silly bands were cool too. It's
Yeah.
yeah, as kids, like you said, all those things are very stupid. We shouldn't, even as a 5 or 6 year old, those things are just dumb, things to value in the grand scheme of things. But for some reason, just everyone valued them so well. And I think even as adults, it's the same thing. The things that we value are quite dumb, right? But it's everyone just happens to value the same thing.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because your preferences for what is of value change so much based on your age group. At the age of 12, it's silly bands, and then at the age of 17, it's a car, the age of like 25, it's like a Chanel bag. At the age of like 40, it's like a house. And then like 50, 60, it's like things like meditation. And then like age of 80, it's like equipment, like hearing aids, things like that. And then like 90, 95, it's like having friends. And it's like these things that we think are so valuable right now, in like 5 years, we'll look back at them like, why were we even tripping about silly bands? Like, why were we even caring?
Yeah, exactly. I think last time we talked about like the value of like products in relation to money, but like we didn't mention how like the value you place on certain things changes with age. And I think that's so interesting because like now, for example, like if you ask me, do I want, $1 million house or do I want like kids? Like I would take the house, right?
Yeah.
But I think to someone who, let's say, to someone who's like 40 and can't have kids or has never had kids, like they would probably take kids, even though kids, like from an economic standpoint, they waste money, they take your money, right? And like there's not really like that much of a net like economic gain.
Yeah, there's no financial benefit.
Yeah, but to that person, like they can't have kids, so like they would trade like maybe like 2 or 3 houses just to have that one kid, even if like from a financial standpoint, like to everyone else, that seems very stupid.
Yeah, it's like, I feel like we never discuss this. We never discuss how your demands change based on age. Instead, we always discuss how like society's demands have been changing based on like trends and things like that. But like at an individual level, you can have a graph set up with like age and money for each product that you're about to buy. And then there's always spikes in that graph. Like at the age of 12, like there would be a huge spike in how much I'm willing to pay for silly bands. And then the rest of my life, it like goes back down to like almost zero, like literally like 1 cent.
Yeah. And I think that this brings up an interesting question as to whether or not these desires are kind of innate, like to what degree they're influenced by society. Because like let's say that we had like a whole society of 25-year-olds and then we had like 5 90-year-olds. Would those 90-year-olds have their own desires, or would they kind of be influenced by everything the 25-year-olds were interested in, right? Because the idea is like when you're in an age group, everyone in the age group, you're interested in certain things, right? But that's because we have like we know like internally we know what age group or what like demographic we belong to. But like if, for example, our society didn't have a large number of people in that demographic, would we be skewed by other like ages, like design trends? Because like people who are 40, like they see all these 13-year-olds like getting rich off TikTok and they're like, yeah, I don't really care, right? But people who like, but I think us, even though we're like sort of like older than the TikTok, I mean we still kind of use TikTok, but let's say like millennials, they're kind of older than the TikTok age, but they still kind of like they still kind of use it, like they're influenced by it, but less than someone who's like 45.
Yeah, no, that's such an interesting question. Like the question of, if we didn't have a demographic that we belonged in, would we just mold ourselves to fit in with a new one, or would we create our own interests?
Yeah.
That's so interesting. And I feel like if there was only one person above the age of 60 in the whole United States, everyone else was a teenager, like that person would be forced to find interest in TikTok because that's what everyone else in society is using.
Yeah.
And there's no one else for him to like be compatible with. And then the question becomes, would that person find interest in TikTok? Yeah.
I guess, I don't know. That's what I'm like, I think it depends on kind of your vicinity to the generation that we're talking about, because like, I guess, like I said, like, millennials, let's say, who are like 25, they are kind of close. Like they still have quite a bit of overlap from like the Gen Z generation, which is like, like younger people in their teens right now. And so they still have a lot of overlap in like the Instagram. They like, I guess some use Facebook, TikTok, like Snapchat, those platforms. So they have that in common. Versus someone who's like 65, they have almost like nothing in common with a 13-year-old generation, because they like, like they grew up with a time where there was like no computers and they didn't have cell phones. And so they have very little in common with the generation. So I think it would be harder for them to mold themselves versus like, depending on how far you are from the demographic, like
I see,
the harder it is for you to kind of like take interest in the things that they're interested in.
Yeah, it's like the concept of we're products of our environments.
Yeah.
And that means that our interests are also crafted by our environments. So it's like you can't make fun of teenagers for using TikTok or playing Minecraft because the fact that all of them are doing that just shows that the environment we've created for them has caused them to find interest in those things. Like it's all based on what we foster as adults for the children, right? Like if we were to create an environment that supported like a child's interest in reading, then there's a huge chance that like all the children today would be reading books instead of watching TikToks. Like it's not like inherently you come out of the womb and you want to watch TikToks. No, it's like you come out of the womb and then you experience things and then your experiences shape your interests and your interests then become watching TikTok. But if we had changed their experiences from the start to like to read books more, then they would be reading books more.
That's so interesting that you bring that up, like the previous generation kind of molding the environment for the next generation, because the idea is that like for like older people, like let's say in their 40s, they were the parental generation of the Gen Z, like people who use TikTok. So they kind of create an environment where TikTok can become a trend, but they themselves kind of despise that trend.
Yeah, and it's funny how like every generation kind of makes fun of the generation, the next one, because they're like, oh, like that's so immature. Like back in my day, like I would never stare at like a computer screen or an iPhone for that long, just watching stupid videos. But it's like, yes, you would if you were born in that generation. You 100% would because your experiences would make you want to do that.
Yeah, and I think it goes the other way around too. Like the previous generation always looks down on like the generation after them, but the generation, like the younger generation, always looks back on the previous generation, right? I think that like young people always like, you know, old people like they're outdated, you know, their sense of values, they're outdated, and like we know better and blah blah blah. I think every young person goes through that kind of phase. And so it's kind of like a perpetual cycle of, you know, like people, I think there's this famous quote by, I forgot the name, the person who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. He was just like, I think it's like, basically he was saying like once he aged, he realized how wise his dad was. And it was just kind of like, I think it's a perpetual cycle. Like we always think we know better than the other generations, but then we realize that, oh, it's just like human nature is kind of just like this. And we realize how the world works as we move through life.
That's interesting. Which, I mean, it kind of brings up the question, like, is a 60-year-old always going to be more wise than like a 15-year-old? Always?
I think I guess it like goes back down to what is like actually wisdom. Because there's like difference between wisdom and like knowledge, for example.
Yeah.
I think wisdom, like, I guess by definition, I feel like wisdom comes from experience.
Right.
You know, because like when you think of, like wisdom, it comes from like years and years of experience, and a 6-year-old just naturally has more like experience than a 13-year-old. But a 13-year-old, I think, could have more knowledge. You know, they could know more than the 6-year-old. But I think the wisdom will come from a 6-year-old.
Well, what if the 60-year-old was put into what is that jail called when you're not allowed to, like it's like a form of isolation when you're not allowed to see anyone and you're locked in a room alone.
Yeah,
I'm forgetting what it's called. There's a punishment for it, but it's like it's a very cruel punishment because you're left alone with your thoughts for like years, just in a room. And so let's say there was a 60-year-old who went through that for 50 years of his life. Okay, he got in when he was let's say he got in when he was 20 and he was in there for 40 years. And then he gets out at 60 years old.
Okay.
And then you have another person who is just a 20-year-old.
Okay.
Who would be more wise? Because technically they've experienced the same amount of external life. It's just the 6-year-old was locked alone in his own thoughts the whole time. But I mean, can you gain experiences without actually going outside? Like, can you gain experiences in your own mind?
I think this brings up an interesting question. It's like, are experiences defined by like the time value, or are experiences defined by like the amount of like things that happen in your life? You know, like if, for example, like if I work like the same job, 9 to 5, for like 30 years, do I have less experience than someone who spent those 30 years traveling the world?
I see.
It's like, how
Yeah,
do we define it? And I would say that experience is defined by time. I think
you
that I
would.
have, yeah. Like, I think this is kind of biased because I've never been one of the, like, someone who has put a huge emphasis in traveling. Like, I've never had a dream to travel the world. Like, traveling is nice to me, but it's not like something that I desire to achieve. But I would say, like, you know, 30 years spent working a job would be like a life-changing experience to me, you know, and it would be like, and I would say that that experience would be more valuable, and it would like be just as valuable as someone who wanted to like travel the world in those 30 years rather than me who's like stayed in the same job.
That is so interesting because I completely disagree.
Really?
I feel like if you spent 30 years traveling the world, you'd have much more experiences. And I think it just goes back to like the mundaneness and repetitiveness of a job, like a 9 to 5 job, versus like the constant excitement and new cultures and new people that you're experiencing when you travel. And I too have not been someone who like has always dreamt about traveling the world.
Yeah.
But like the few times I have gone out, whether it be like on a hike halfway across the country or something like that,
Yeah.
even though I'm not technically meeting people because it's just a hike, just the experience of going out, it sounds cliche, but it always gives you, I guess, more wisdom, more conventional wisdom, because just that whole process leaves your mind sort of wandering versus doing repetitive, mundane tasks for 30 years. Like, yeah, you're going to gain experiences from that, but I don't think you're going to gain as much wisdom as someone who has been traveling and experiencing other cultures.
I don't know. I think I would disagree because I think about the amount of dedication that it takes to stay at the same job for like 30 years. And I would say that that takes a lot more discipline than
Yeah.
someone who wanted to travel the world for 30 years instead. Like, it's very easy to decide, like, I'm going to get on a plane and like, I'm going to go to Jamaica and I'm going to go to Africa and I'm going to go to like, you know, like China, I'm going to go to whatever, like all these different places. But it's very hard to say, like, I mean, like, I guess on a personal level, I would say like it's harder to stay at a job like when you see other people traveling and when you see other people using their time in other ways. And I would say like almost that kind of discipline will give you a lot more wisdom than someone who took the easier route and kind of like, let's say, like enjoyed their time more.
That's interesting. Like, just the concept of like being strict on yourself and having discipline, that in itself is a form of wisdom.
Yeah.
Do you think that form of wisdom would be broken when you indulge? Like, let's say you've been working a job for 30 years and just that you've seen all of your coworkers leave the job, you've seen them, you know, they've gone traveling, they've gotten married, you've just been staying at your job, trying to move up the ranks at your job. You've gained tons of experience trying to become CEO. But then all of a sudden, you decide, you know what, it's not for me. You quit your job and you move to LA to like try to become like an actor, right? Since you have just broken that discipline you've been building up for 30 years, does all of your wisdom of discipline go away?
I would say no, but I also think that it's very uncommon that that would happen. Like, I think it's quite uncommon that someone who, if you have the discipline enough to go 30 years, I would doubt that you would stop there, if that makes sense. Because each time, like each second that you spend longer at the job, the stakes almost get higher, right? It's like if you only quit after 1 year, then, I mean, it shows you did have discipline, but it's like the stakes were not as high after 1 year because you had less to lose, because you had less experience and less like things that like, you know, less riding for you on the job. But if you quit after 30 years, you just had so much riding on that. I doubt, like, I feel like that's very rare that someone would spend 30 years and then just like give it all up.
That's a good point. That's a good point. I guess I see things kind of differently, like especially just now with like coronavirus and stay-at-home orders. in
Yeah.
March, early March, even before any like laws were put to place to, prevent social distancing, even before things were closed, I sort of just stayed at home and refused to go out because I was like, we don't know anything about this virus. It could be spreading right now. I might as well play it safe. I
Yeah.
had lots of motivation to do it. And it's been like, how long has it been since March? March, April, May,
Yeah. Yeah.
June, right? It's been like 4-ish months. And now things are a lot worse. Now it's
Uh-huh.
way unsafe to go out. Back then, it was safe to go out. There's only like a couple people with the virus, but I still stayed at home. Now it's way unsafe. Logically speaking, I would be better off if I just continued my streak of staying at home. But also now it's like I can't stay at home for longer than 4 months. Now I want to go out with a mask, of course, but like I want to go out. Like I can't just have the same motivation I've had for 4 months, even though it would be breaking my streak of discipline. I feel like the longer I stay at home, the more I want to go out.
That's interesting because the way I feel like, I mean, yeah, I do understand because I do have like an urge to go out more now, but I feel like sometimes like when you like have an urge to go out, do you ever feel like, oh, if I go out and I get the virus now, then all of the time I wasted at home would have been like, then all the time I spent at home would have been wasted.
Yeah.
I feel like I kind of feel like conflicting, like conflicting feeling between those two extremes. That's like I really want to go out right now because I've been at home for like 3 months, and if I go out now, those whole 3 months were wasted.
I think there's a concept for that when you have to balance out the past with the future and realize that your past and your future are completely disconnected. Like it's the whole concept of like if you flip a coin 10 times, the first 9 times you get a tail, you're going to think that your 10th time you're going to get tails. But you still have a 50% chance of getting heads your 10th time. Like the coin has not changed. It's still a 50% chance. So if someone says like, if you flip heads on your 10th try, I'll give you $1 million, and you say no because I've gotten tails the last 9 times, that would be stupid because you still have a 50% chance. So it's like the whole concept of forgetting what you've done in the past and completely creating a new decision based on what you know now and for the future.
Oh, I think that's interesting that you think of like going outside, you think of life as kind of a probability question. Like if I say like right now, if I go outside, I have a 25% chance or whatever of getting coronavirus. And then the next day I still have a 25% chance. And it's like every day the clock kind of like resets. So like every decision you make is its own decision. Like it's not based off of the previous decisions that you have made. I think that's a very good way of viewing kind of like life, because I think that like it forces you to stay in the present. It's like your previous decisions don't define you.
Yeah. Like most people would say, okay, I have a 25% chance. That means I can only go once, because if I go 4 times, then chances are I'll contract it at least once. But no, that's not how probability works. It's like you have a 25% chance anytime you go. That doesn't mean you're going to get it after your 4th time, and it doesn't mean you're not going to get it your first time. Like it just means that there's a 25 objective percent chance, period.
Yeah, I think that this has always puzzled me. Like, why do you feel like us as humans, we have this kind of we have a kind of sense that like in the probability question, if I ask you like, oh, like as if like I flipped a coin 9 times already and it was all heads. What do you think it's going to be on the 10th time? You kind of have like, even though in your mind you know that it's 50-50 heads, tails, you kind of have like an inkling, like you want to say it's heads, right? You kind of have an urge to say it's the same thing like, oh, like a family, like we've had kids and they're all girls so far. There has to be a boy this time. But like,
but
right?
that's
like,
the opposite though.
Yeah, that's but like we kind of have a sense like, why is it like, why do we think this way? Like, even though we know the answer is like, like it's 50% chance it's a boy, 50% chance it's a girl. Like, why do we think this way still?
Yeah. No, wait. It's so interesting that you mentioned both sides of things.
Yeah.
That it can be the opposite too.
Yeah.
Like, if you've had 3 boys, you're going to try one more time because obviously it'll be a girl. It can't be a boy again. That would be so impossible. Yeah. Well, no, there's still 50% chance. And then the same thing goes the other way. Like you flip the coin 9 times, it's heads. Okay, there's probably a trend. It's probably going to be heads again.
Yeah.
Well, no, it can be tails. And it's like, when do we use which approach? Because those are two approaches. The first approach is
Yeah.
it's definitely going to be the opposite because it's been
Uh-huh.
what it is right now so many times. And the second approach is it's definitely going to be the same because it's been the same so many times.
Yeah. Like, why do we think that way? Like, why do our, like, kind of our unconsciousness or our almost like innate being, like, we want to go for the least rational solution, even though we know the rational solution. Why does something keep telling us that that's not correct? Like, it's so weird that we think that way.
And yeah, and like, it's the same thing with like stocks too.
Yeah.
With stocks, it's like, oh, it's so high, it can't go higher. It's gonna go down now. This is its peak, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But like rationally, if it's going higher, then why would it stop going higher? Like what?
Yeah.
There has to be some force that stops it from going higher.
Uh-huh.
And those two mentalities are what drive the stock market forward because like the whole concept is that when you buy, someone else is selling, right? And so that's the reason someone else is selling because they think it's going up, you think it's going down.
Yeah.
And I can't, like, the entire stock market just is based off of that concept.
I think it's so weird that our entire intuition is just like wrong. Like our human, like what intuition tells us, it's so flawed. Like we make those decisions in our life, you know, like, oh yeah, it's been 3 girls. I have to try. Maybe like this time it's going to be a boy. Like we make those decisions in our life, like life changing decisions, like having another kid, right? Like and based on this kind of human intuition, and our intuition is like almost always wrong.
And it's also like sometimes if you think of things in too much of a probabilistic way, then it kind of screws up your whole life. Like let's say there's a guy and he doesn't work out, he's not fit, he's not ready for a relationship, he's emotionally unstable, blah blah blah.
Okay.
Like he says, okay, if I approach 50 girls, at least one will say yes. At least one, just logically. And anyone would agree, like, okay, if you approach 50, at least one will give you her number.
Yeah.
Well, no, one won't give you her number because you're not dressed well, you're not fit, you don't look good, people don't want to be with you. It's you that's the problem, but you are using probability to mask your problem. And in that case, your problem outweighs the probability because out of the 50 girls, every single one is going to say no because you just aren't up for par for a relationship. Versus if you have like a super well-built guy, he's confident, he's good looking, he's content with himself, he doesn't need a relationship, but he's willing to get one because he's emotionally stable, and he goes to 50 girls, like people will say, oh, okay, like at least one will reject him. At least one will reject him. Well, no, he might get all 50 girls' numbers just because, like, at the end of the day, it's not just a probability question. And people just like to reduce things to simple probabilities, even when oftentimes the problem is them.
I think this is interesting that, like, thinking of things purely in terms of probability will, like, mess with your decision making. I think that it goes both ways. Like, sometimes, like, our human intuition messes with us, like the thing with the boy girl example, right? That is obviously, that's an irrational decision, and that could lead to, like, you know, long-term consequences. But in this case, like, going by probability actually hinders you because if you're an ugly guy who doesn't work out, doesn't take care of himself, then chances are you're not going to, like, it's not going to follow the rules of probability. And so, like, yeah, it's so interesting that, like, we kind of, like, always straddle that line between rational thought and our kind of inner, like, intuition. And we somehow know when to use either of them, right? Like, we somehow know that, like, when, that, like, this guy is, even if the probability says so, this guy is not going to get any girl's number. Like, we know that, and our intuition knows that. And so, but we know when to use, like, these different methods of decision making.
Yeah, that honestly, that blows my mind because it's like, where do you balance rational thought and probabilities and intuition? And I think what makes a person successful is where they balance those three things, wherever they put the balance on, because that's when you're taking the perfect amount of risks. That's when you're improving yourself the most and putting your own blame on yourself the most. And that's when you understand, like, your own intuition best.
No, I think I realize, like, now that I'm thinking about it, I realize I do this, like, every single day. Like, I was just, like, like, for example, like I was like, I wanted to shop online, but then like rationally, I was like, oh my God, I'm not going to spend my money on this thing because it's like useless, right? And I would rather keep my money invested, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But then like the other part of me is just like, oh, you know, you like want it, and so I might as well just get it, whatever. Just like go with your gut and just get it.
Yeah.
But like I always like sometimes I like succumb to like my gut like desire instinct, and then sometimes I go with my rational thought. And I think you're right. Like how successful a person becomes is like how well they can balance those two like voices in their head, like the one that is rational and the one is just like, no, just go for it, just do it. Like
yeah, because even like both voices are equally right. Like obviously logically you'd think like, oh, like always go with the rational one. Well, no, if you go with the rational one, you're never going to take the risks to start a business. You're never going to take the risks to go approach that girl who could be your wife. Like you're never going to take any risks because rationally risks are just bad, period.
Exactly.
And so it definitely is a question of balance. So with that, I think we should conclude the episode.
Yeah, thank you guys all for listening, and we'll see you all next time.